This is the American Indians, indigenous peoples' truths. Justice for all, the most dangerous show on media anywhere. NSJ, OCO, Taishu, Shadana Lai, Ayajagola Waya Sonoy. I'm Jay Winter Nightwolf, and welcome to Jay Winter Nightwolf Live. And now it's time for news from Indian country.
OCO, Tuijan. Welcome to all my brothers and sisters. I'm Don Walker, and News from Indian Country is now in session. Something very important and very historic has taken place that I think should be celebrated by all peoples across the country. Senate makes a history with vote confirming Haaland as Interior Secretary. Cronkite News. The Senate Monday confirmed New Mexico's Representative Deb Hillebrand as the next Interior Secretary. A historic vote that makes her the first Native American to head a cabinet agencies. This is really big. The confirmation came over the objection of Senate Republicans, particularly those representing Western states dependent on fossil fuels, who have called Haaland an environmental extremist. And four Republicans who voted to confirm the nomination pointed to Haaland's reputation as a bipartisan House member, as well as an historic nature of her nomination. This confirmation of Deb Hillebrand is amazing. And Senate Majority Leader Schumer said that the 51-40 confirmation vote, it creates a government more embodies the full richness and diversity of our country. This is a great day for that. The next news article I want to deliver to you comes from National Politics Trust. It's a bill that removes blood quantum from citizens of the 5 civilized tribes. A bill that addresses a long-standing blood quantum issue in Oklahoma has been introduced in the U.S. House. Under a law known as the Stigler Act of 1947, citizens of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole nations, also known as the 5 civilized tribes, are treated differently when it comes to their allotments. They must possess at least 1/2 Indian blood in order for their lands to be held in restricted fee status. The status is important because it protects Indian lands from state and local taxation, regulation, and jurisdiction. It also makes it harder for non-Indian entities to acquire such lands. I think we ought to have that for all Native Americans. But citizens of the 5 civilized tribes whose blood quantum falls below the standard have their lands automatically converted to fee status, whether they like it or not. That opens them up to state and local encroachments. Additionally, leasing, probate, and other activities are handled at state court, another disparity that will new bill will seek to address. Introducing this amendment to the Stigler Act will allow for past president to be current with the realities of native-owned restricted land. Many of Oklahoma's citizens have passed out of one half-blood lineage, but remain vested to their Native American heritage. Removing the one half-blood degree prerequisite and expanding its range to all degree will help preserve the rights and legacy of Native American tribes and their inheritance. Leaders and citizens of the 5 civilized tribes have long called for the removal of the blood quantum requirement. They note that it will help keep Indian land in Indian hands and treats them as in a manner similar to nearly every other tribe in the United States. Prior efforts to address this disparity have been controversial. That concludes it. Thank you, Jay. Back to you.
Thank you, Don, or should I say Judge Walker. Tonight I have a very, very special guest, one of my brothers from Oklahoma. He's a member of the Great Creek Nation. He's a historian, he's a writer, he's an activist, and he's all of that and more. The title of the show is The Other Story About Black Wall Street.
Hi, Jay.
Hey, Sandra, how you doing? My co-host, Sandra Hope, is here too.
I'm well, thank you.
Good.
Excited to hear about this other side of the story.
There you go. The term Black Wall Street was used until the Tulsa race riot of 1921. The name has also been applied more generally to districts of African American high economic activity. Historically, African Americans worked mainly as servants in Tulsa, where they developed their own insular society with its own economy. The Tulsa Race Massacre, known alternatively as the Tulsa Race Riot, the Greenwood Massacre, Black Wall Street Massacre, the Tulsa Program, or the Tulsa Massacre, took place on May 31st to June the 1st, 1921. With mobs of white residents, many of them deputized and given weapons by city officials, attacked Black residents. One name that comes to mind is Ottawa W. Gurley. He was a Black educator, entrepreneur, and landowner who was born to former enslaved Africans at the beginning of the 20th century, and he bought 20 acres of land in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Tulsa riot erupted in the city's all-Black Greenwood district on May 31st and continued through the morning of June the 1st, 1921. It was triggered by the arrest of a 19-year-old Dick Rowland, an African-American shoe shiner who worked in the white downtown business area of Tulsa. The massacre left somewhere between 30 to 300 people dead, mostly African Americans, and destroyed Tulsa's prosperity, its prosperous Black neighborhood of Greenwood, known as the Black Wall Street. More than 1,400 homes and businesses were burned, and nearly 10,000 people were left homeless. Before the Tulsa Race Massacre, where the city's Black district of Greenwood was attacked by a white mob, resulting in 2 days of bloodshed and destruction. And the area had been considered one of the most affluent African American communities in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. The massacre, which began on May 31st, 1921, and left hundreds of Black residents dead and thousands of homes destroyed, often overshadows the history of the vulnerable Black enclave itself. Greenwood District was a population of over 10,000 people at the time. It thrived and the epicenter of African American business and culture, particularly on bustling Greenwood Avenue, commonly known as Black Wall Street. The other story. My guest is my good friend and brother. We've known each other for a while, but we haven't had a chance to talk in a long while. Eli Grayson. Eli, how are you, bro?
Doing good. I'm just was listening to you read some of those myths
Yeah.
about Tulsa, and the massacre did occur, like you said, on those dates.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the backstory needs to be clarified because there's a backstory to the reasons why the all-Black towns and communities in eastern Oklahoma, formerly Indian Territory, was successful. The first one you said was O.W. Gurley buying 40 acres of land to create Greenwood. All of that falls into a lot of myth.
Mm-hmm.
What really happened, the area of Tulsa was already settled by the Loja-Boja people, which is one of the tribal towns or tribal bands that make up the Creek Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
They landed back in the 1830s, 1838 or something like that, is when they landed in the Tulsa area. And then you had the Tulsa Canadian tribal town, which was also in the area. And with that, you had people of African descent whom the Creeks had enslaved. And they were with them. They came with them on the Trail of Tears as property.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Black person had been here for decades before 1921. The Tulsa area really started to take off after the Civil War because of the Perryman family. The Perryman family had been Creeks, of course, and they were the big slaving family in the Creek Nation. And the area of lands that they worked in the Creek Nation was up in the Tulsa region. Right. Now, historically, you have to look at where Tulsa is actually located. Tulsa is located on the border of three tribes. The Muskogee Creek Nation, which makes up most of Tulsa. Tulsa is located within the Creek Nation to the south. Then to the north, where you find North Tulsa, or the majority of Greenwood community known as the Black Wall Street, it's located within the Cherokee Nation. And to the west of that is the Osage Nation, which the Osage purchased from the Cherokee Nation and moved there after the Civil War. That's a whole nother story.
Right.
But Tulsa itself, after the Curtis Act was passed and there was talk of statehood and the ending of the 5 civilized tribes, white people started to move here in droves. And they basically squatted in the area where Tulsa is located. They also squatted in Muskogee and Wagner and places like that. But in Tulsa area, they squatted. They were able to lobby Congress to say the Creek Nation wanted them off this land. The Creeks wouldn't allow them to build schools. The Creeks wouldn't allow them to put plumbing, to build roads, to build their churches, because they were illegal immigrants. And the Creek Nation wanted them off their lands. But they knew how to lobby Congress. And Congress then passed the Town Site Act of 1901. And it basically took 654 acres from the Creek Nation and created the town site of Tulsa, which is where downtown Tulsa is located today, in the southeastern part of Greenwood, and pretty much the area that became known as the Black Wall Street was located in the northeast corner of that section of Townsite, Tulsa. And so the story of Gurley buying 40 acres and all of that would have been impossible. First of all, he wasn't a tribal member. You had to be a member of a tribe to actually participate in the allotment process. And then you had the downtown area, the town site of Tulsa, the 654 acres. It was actually divided up, platted out by Gus and Dave Patton in 1902. And they were hired by the Creek Nation to do this under the Department of Interior. This is I'm telling you this in a really short format. And so the streets, all the streets in downtown Tulsa was named by Gus and Dave Patton, even the street named Greenwood Boulevard, because Gus and Dave Patton were from Greenwood, Arkansas. So they stuck that in there. They got that name of the street. Where Archer is located, famously, if you come to Tulsa and if you go into the Greenwood area, and pretty much what you see on the corner of Greenwood and Archer is what is remaining of pretty much the last part of what we know as the Black Wall Street.
Right.
Archer back in the day was actually called First Street North, not Archer. It was renamed. But Greenwood Boulevard was named by Gus and Dave Patton. Now, when you go north of that area, you're entering into the Cherokee Nation. And that particular allotment was given to a woman named Mary Turley, who was a half white, half Indian Cherokee woman who had intermarried with a white man named James Turley, who was a big-time real estate developer. And she fell right into the scheme of a lot of stuff that was going on in those days around town sites, where white developers would marry Indian women, whether the Indians were white Indians, full bloods, or black Indians. They were seeking to marry them because they can then participate in the land, ownership. So Greenwood actually got its start, not because of a guy that moved from Arkansas to Oklahoma territory and then came over to Indian territory and started a community. No, the black community had already existed there for decades in that area. At one point it was called Hodges Bend. And this is what I'm talking about. You have the native black perspective of what's here, and then you have the state black perspective of what's here. The native black is a black person who's been with one of these tribes since the removal. They came on the Trail of Tears. I don't know what kind of words I can use here, but in those days, they were called the Indians Negro, compared to the state's Negro, which would have been a person from Arkansas or Texas or Missouri or Kansas. That would be a black person classified as a state Negro. But if you lived in Indian territory and you were a tribal member, and if you were black, then you were called a native black or the Indians Negro, a person who's been here since the Trail of Tears. Okay, so the area up there is much older than the state blacks narrative on the founding of Greenwood. It's almost insulting to the native blacks when they hear about a guy that shows up and decide to build a town before statehood. You gotta understand, he's not a tribal member. He supposedly came here before statehood and did. Anyway, it falls into the myth scenario. And that's unfortunate because there were some things that Gurley did which were profound. He was a real estate agent. He did own property. He was one of the persons who handled the real estate transactions between a lot of immigrating black people from the states that moved here after statehood. So he has his place in history, but giving him credit of buying 40 acres and starting that part of North Tulsa is just not true. It just legally couldn't have made any sense.
But you know something, Eli. When you start telling the truth about what really happened, it turns heads. But it makes white folks mad, but at the same time, it satisfies a lot of the curiosities of all the other people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, the truth is, brother, the real story of what's going on in Indian Territory as it pertains to the native blacks is much more interesting than what's been written and told in current books to basically brand the area that the city wants to turn into a tourist attraction.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, when you think about the land allotments that happened in the 5 civilized tribes from January 1st of 1898 to April 26, 1906, in the Muskogee Creek Nation, each tribal member got 160-acre allotment.
Right. Right.
Part of the Dawes Act and the Burke Act of April 26, 1906. Okay, the reason for it is the creation of statehood. The tribal governments were going to end. They wanted the government wanted them to divide up all this land and then give it out equally to its members. As far as the Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole tribes, each member, black, red, or white, got 160 acres. In the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation, the intermarried white, the Indians, and the white Indians got 320 acres. And if you were a Indian with African blood or a freedman, you only got 40 acres. It was racism was real.
Mhm.
In the Creek Nation, each citizen got, whether he was red, black, or white, male, female, a child, or an adult, got 160 acres. And why that is significant to the all black communities in Tulsa, in eastern Oklahoma, most of them are located in the Creek Nation. But significantly, like Greenwood, Bowling, you hear about Bowling, you hear about Grayson, you hear about Rentisville, Taft, others like that, is because the freedmen in the Creek Nation, who were former enslaved people of the Creek Nation who were made tribal members in 1866, received, just the freedmen, 1,092,240 acres in the Creek Nation. That was their total allotment. Now, when you look at the entire state of Georgia in 1900, the entire population of black people, which were hundreds of thousands of people, only owned about 1 million acres, and most of it was in debt. In the Creek Nation, where you only roughly had 8,000 freedmen who received land allotments, there's over 1.1 million acres that the freedmen actually own.
Right.
I haven't even mentioned the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, who their blacks also receive land allotments. So literally in eastern Oklahoma, at statehood, you had between the Indians of African descent and the freedmen, which are two different people,
Right.
you had nearly 3 million acres that were allotted to them in eastern Oklahoma. And Oklahoma's economy in those days, in 1910, 1920, 1930, was agriculture. And if you own rural land, you did pretty well. And then the discovery of oil and gas, the Glenpool, the Cushing, which made this area the Saudi Arabia of the world. If you own land, you really did well. So you can now see what was the foundation of why Greenwood was called the Black Wall Street. It wasn't because of a barber shop. It wasn't because of a retail store or any of that. Those were just, basically needs that, because people were making money out in the rural area, and because of Jim Crow laws in Oklahoma, where black people can only spend money in black neighborhoods and towns, black community did really well because of the oil and gas industry and agriculture, and the fact that their lands were free of debt. They didn't owe the white man no money on that land. There was no banks to be paid.
Right.
And, so they did a lot of sharecropping, and it was one of the hostile things about the immigrating white man from Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee when they got here and they wanted to sharecrop land. Well, they weren't sharecropping most likely from a white man. It was either a Indian or a black person who was a member of one of those tribes. They didn't like that.
So Eli,
Go ahead.
Eli, what led you? Was there an instigating event that led you to want to become so familiar with this history and to fill in all the gaps? Was there something that?
I'm Creek. I am a unabashed. I glory in being Creek. Everybody knows that here who knows me. If you come to my home, you walk into a Creek home, And so learning my own history and my own family and the fact that my grandfather, who I'm named for, land allotment is part of Tulsa. His sisters, his brothers, his uncles, his aunts, all make up part of what's known as Tulsa, Oklahoma. So moving here moving here from California. Lived out in California for decades, and when I moved here, I wanted to experience living in the Creek Nation, and living where my ancestors were. In California, I served as the president of the California Muskogee Creek Association for 13 years, and I really dove myself into history. And then I got involved with the freedmen fight because the Creek Nation had booted the freedmen out in 1979. And I'm going, what? They did what?
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't sit back and smile at my cousins who are Indians thinking this is okay. We got to do something about this. And we shouldn't be waiting on the court to do something that we know is wrong. And what I was told in California as president of the Creek Association was that we don't talk about those things. And I said, well, why do we have people called the freedmen? I've never even heard of it. I never knew the Creek Nation enslaved black people. That was shocking to me. And to find out that it was some of my own direct ancestors that were participating in the evil of the institution of slavery, it just tore me up because I had a chip on my shoulder thinking, oh, that was the white man's thing, not the Indian thing, So I got involved that way and started as a member of the Creek Nation fighting for the rights, the treaty rights, Article 2 of the 1866 treaty, rights of the freedmen. And what it says is very simple. There's 5 conditions in Article 2 of the Creek Treaty of 1866. 1, you won't enslave Negroes anymore. That's over. That's 1. 2, the Africans that you did enslave are now your citizens. 3, they have an equal interest in the nation's funds, tribes' funds. 4, they have an equal interest in the nation's land. And 5, the United States government is to treat the Africans of the Creek Nation the same as the native citizens. That's the condition of the treaty. It's very simple to understand that. And for people to think that, so the game they told me was that, well, they don't have Indian blood. And I'm like, I know I can't cuss on your show, but this brother knows I do a lot of that because I go off on people. I was like, wait a minute, let's bag this up. You're telling me that black people in the state of Mississippi have to prove they have white blood to be a citizen of the state of Mississippi after they've been enslaved by white people in Mississippi? And you're telling me that black people in the Creek Nation should have Indian blood who've been enslaved by Indians to be a citizen of the Creek Nation? Let's bag that up. Let's see how that don't make any sense.
Oh, hell no.
So, so the argument was that the Africans had to be this is the new argument since 1979. This didn't exist before 1979. In 1979, that's when they came up with this theory that the descendants of former enslaved people of African descent have to prove they have Indian ancestry to be a member of the Creek Nation. And the only way that could have happened is through raping a African woman. And I'm like, do you really want to go there? No, you don't want to go there with me. So that's where I really got involved, because I thought it was a deplorable thing to do, to kick Black people out after they had been with you for centuries. And then now you want them out because you got casino revenue coming on? Oh, please, no.
So then you're saying that not only did the feds violate the treaty, not only did the states violate the treaty, but the actual tribe violated the treaty.
Yeah, and that's what the tribe is going around tooting its horn about the win with McGirt. And, I want to back up because your brother Walker talked about the Stigler Act. The Stigler Act amendment passed 3 years ago. It's already signed by Donald Trump. They did remove the blood quantum for people who still had their lands in trust. And now they can just pass it on to any of their kids without worrying about the blood quantum. Guess who they left out of that Stigler Act? They left the Black Creeks out of that Stigler Act. They left the Black Cherokees out of that Stigler Act. So when they were negotiating this, I started raising my hand and going, what about the allotments of the freedmen? They still have their land allotments too. Why are their lands being taxed? But now that you're almost white, you don't want to pay taxes. But you start taxing Black lands back in the 1920s. Something's not right about that. And they were like, well, we're going to deal with the freedmen later. We just want to get this language passed. And we are sure Donald Trump is going to sign this. We don't want to muddy the water, all this BS. And guess what? They passed that bill and they left the freedmen out once again. So when I came to Tulsa, I really came here mad. I mean, not only wanting to live here, but also wanting to give a voice to people who are they literally had Black people here who are freedmen descendants running around looking for Granny the Indian. And what I mean by that is that because they have convinced them that you needed Indian blood to be a member of the Creek Nation, Cherokee Nation, so forth. So these Black people went running around looking for Grandma the Indian. And what they kept running into was the Indian that owned Grandma. And I kept saying, wait a minute. Here's the thing. The treaties in 1866, one, never required the tribe to free Black people with Indian blood. It said Africans. Okay. And two, it never said give those people with Indian blood citizenship. It said Africans.
Okay.
Enslaved.
Let me say this. So everybody out there that's viewing this show, you see why I brought Eli Grayson on, because the truth must be told. All of the lies that you've heard about Black Wall Street, Greenwood, and all of that, not true.
Well, it's true in the sense that it was a very successful community, but there's another story.
Exactly. But that's why I'm happy you agreed to come on this broadcast, Eli. So let's talk about how Wall Street, Black Wall Street, Greenwood, got to be so economically independent.
It happened because Oklahoma was a Jim Crow state.
Right.
And if you had a drop of Negro blood in you, you can shop in Macy's. You can shop in Woolworths. You can shop in, the white stores. You have to do business in the Black communities.
Mm-hmm.
And back in those days, Black communities thrived because in this area, where nearly 3 million acres of eastern Oklahoma was owned by Black folk, producing crops, peanuts, cotton, everything. And particularly when World War I went down and Europe needed crops, they needed peanuts, they needed, flour, they needed rice, they needed everything. And if you were in eastern Oklahoma after statehood and a freeman descendant or a black Indian and owned land, you did pretty well. You were able to sell your stuff to Europe. And so that made you money. And where did you spend your money? Well, you can go to the white folks area. You have to go to black towns or to the black communities in those towns to spend your dime. And then that dime recirculated and recirculated and recirculated back again and again and again in the black community. It stayed there.
I
Then
read
you
19
had-
times. I read
Yeah.
that it hit 19 times before it ever left the community.
And then you had oil and gas. This was the Saudi Arabia of the world back in those days. And it's amazing. It's all, you know, and it's one of the things that was so crazy about what went down at statehood in Oklahoma. In 1910, Oklahoma tried to pass the grandfather clause, which would take the voting rights away from black men. Now let's put all of that in perspective. Indian Territory was half the state. It was all allotted out to tribal members. Half of those tribal members, actually more than half of the tribal members, happened to be female, who were landowners, who had no right to vote in the new state of Oklahoma, even though they own half the land. Then you had in Indian Territory a third of the population being black people of those tribes, who the state then took the voting rights away from the men. And they tried to pass that in 1910. The state Supreme Court threw it out. And then the white man got a little smarter and started nipping away at voting rights. So there were no voting rights for black people until the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s corrected. You know, but they, you know, once the white man got control of the state legislature and the governor's office and all this stuff, it was pretty bad for black landowners. They did everything in the world to take their lands away. I mean, they had a policy back in the day. This, I don't know if I could say this on this thing, but this is what happened. If you were living back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, you would have heard this word, and it was called niggerizing.
Right.
And what they would do, this is what they would do. Some land speculator or oil and gas person would show up to your house after they read that Granny had died in the paper, somewhere reported it. And Granny is the original allottee of the land. And particularly in the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl age and the Great Depression, they would show up with a wad of money. It would all be $1 bills, $400, and $1 bills rolled up. And then they'll wrap it with a $100 bill.
Right.
And they'll lay that on the table like it's a whole lot of money. And they'll say, that's all you have to do is sign this. And then you have these funeral homes that really was devastating to black people who own land. Oh, well, why don't you sign over 120 of the 160 acres and we'll give you 3 months to pay off the funeral bill. And they know darn well before those people have left the door, they've already been on the phone calling some oil and gas guy saying, hey, I've got a signature on this land allotment. You want to buy it off me?
Question. All of this is going on, and we know that racism is a social construct. Now, today in tribes, you have these folks that are in charge. They manipulated their way into becoming the chief or the people in charge. And the majority of those folks are what? White Indians?
Well, in the Creek Nation, and definitely in the Cherokee Nation and Chickasaw Nation, in the Creek Nation, unfortunately, there is a blood quantum requirement that you have to be 1/4 Creek blood to run for elective office, whether it's the chief or council. And so, but this is the thing. The Creek Nation population today is roughly about 90,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
about 85 to 87, 88% are less than a quarter blood that cannot run for office. Then you have this small population of people who are over a quarter blood. We have, I don't know, 500, 600 full bloods in the whole tribe. And everybody else is mixed either with a little African or a little more white or whatever. And so you have anybody that's over a quarter running for office, which is a very limited population of people. That's in the Creek Nation. Cherokee Nation doesn't have a black quantum to run for office. And that's why Marilyn Vann is able to run as a Cherokee freedman. There's no black quantum requirement, so she could run. Now, historically, for the Creek Nation, that has never happened since 1979. Before that, you did have black people who was elected into the Creek Nation offices. The Creeks used to be their government used to be set up on a tribal town census. Political thing. The Creeks in 1832, when we signed the removal treaty to leave Alabama and Georgia, we were 82 tribes that made up the Creek Confederacy. My tribe in the Creek Nation is called Eufaula Canadian. That's my people. Though I have Ketchebadaga, Coweta, Halabi, Ofuskee, I got a bunch of different tribes in my ancestry. We're all part of the Creek Confederacy. Each one of those tribal towns is what we call them. They're just political bands. Had a elected member into the House of Kings in the Creek Nation Council, which is like the U.S. Senate.
Right.
And then each tribal town had, depending on their tribal town population, had members elected into the House of Warriors, which is like the U.S. House of Representatives. After the Civil War, and the treaty was signed in 1866, we had roughly about 5,000 enslaved Africans that had become members of our tribe. That was a lot compared to the population of the tribe. And so instead of the council back in those days, instead of absorbing them into the different tribal towns, they decided to create 3 new tribes for them. One is called Canadian Colored, Arkansas Colored, and Norfolk Colored.
Right.
And each one of them became political bands within the Creek Nation that had elected members into the House of Warriors and the House of Kings. The first black judge to serve on a Supreme Court in the U.S. was in 1878. He died in 1883. He served on the Muskogee Creek Nation Supreme Court. His name was Jesse Franklin. He was a former slave of the Creek Nation. This brother could put you to death if you killed somebody. And he did. He was interviewed, and these white people that came to interview him from the U.S. Senate in 1878 was shocked when they said, "You are a judge, but weren't you a slave?" And he was, yes. He said, "But my people made me a judge, and I am now on the Creek Nation Supreme Court." And then he told them how the Creek Nation court worked. You know, if you kill somebody, you were put to death. If you stole, you got whipped. Mm-hmm. You know, if you stole 3 times, you got put to death. And his brother explained it all and how the difference in the district courts and the Supreme Court and the Creek Nation was established. But he's not even known in history. He's not even written in any of Oklahoma history books as the first person of African descent who actually served as a justice of a Supreme Court.
Go figure that one out.
Yep.
I just want to make an announcement. All of you that are watching us tonight, if you're on YouTube, go to YouTube, and where it says like the show, like the Jay Winter Live show. Also, leave a comment, because the more people that know about this, the more educated we all become. That's my announcement. Go ahead, Eli.
Well, you mentioned why were the black towns and black communities successful in Eastern Oklahoma? It was because of the land ownership of the members, black members of the 5 civilized tribes. It was no other reason. The people people, the state blacks that immigrated here just before and after statehood, if you read the old newspapers of the people soliciting them to come here and making it seem like it's a Rwanda of the day, mainly was just pointing out that most of the land that you would be working on is black owned. It's not white owned. And if it's not black owned, it's Indian owned, you know? So it's kind of, in one way it's sad, because then you see through a century how the state of Oklahoma passed laws to dispossess the freedmen out of their lands, as well as the Indians out of their land. And when it came to oil and gas, these crazy guardians that they would put over them by judges. I encourage your viewers to researching Sarah Rector, the richest black girl in America. She's a Creek freedman who received the 160-acre allotment. Her allotment happened to be over on the Cimarron River in Creek County. And she was 2 years old when she got that land. And in 1914, the NAACP did a whole story on her. They basically came to Taft, Oklahoma, got her because everybody knew they were going to kill her. Mm-hmm. And they took her up to Kansas, created a birth certificate that made her white. This is a black girl, made her white. And so she could start getting her oil and gas checks, off her lands. And what was strange, she's running around with no shoes on, and the Jones family over in Bristol had built these mansions over there, basically from oil and gas off her land that her parents had signed on a lease, but not knowing what they were doing. You got to understand how how land actually was perceived not only by Indians, but by the freedmen.
Right.
One, prior to statehood, no one owned land in the Creek Nation or the Cherokee Nation, Choctaw Nation, Chickasaw Nation, Seminole Nation. The land was owned in common by the tribal government. And if you wanted to use the land in the Creek Nation, say, for example, you got married and you want to raise a family, then you would go to the House of Kings and to your Miko, that means the chief of your tribal town, and that would have probably been Canadian, Arkansas, Norfolk, one of those. And you would say, hey, I need 1,000 acres over in this area. And nobody's using that land, and I want to raise my family out there. And the council would then grant you a 2-year lease. So you could do what you need to do out there. And every 2 years, you would go back to the Creek Council to renew your lease. And if you die, your kids didn't inherit no land. They didn't even inherit the improvements on the land. They had to go back to the council to say, we want to continue living here for another 2 years. Now, when the allotments happened, the allotments ended all of that and people became individual land owners. And it was part of the con that the Americans used in the hearings of 1882 called the Conditions of Indians in Indian Territory, where they were trying to talk the Creeks and the Cherokees as such into statehood. And they really thought they could get the black people in the tribe to actually agree to it. And they were saying, well, don't you want to not be under the foot of the tribe? Don't you want to be your own landowner and you could do what you want without worrying about the tribal governments? They were telling all this noise. And the Indians and the black Indians of the tribe would say, no, thank you. We don't want to be a United States citizen. We're fine being Creek. We're fine being Cherokee, whatever. Please take that noise and go back to DC.
Okay. In essence, what they were doing, they were running a master con game. So, Eli, we're out of time. And I want to ask you a favor. Would you come back again?
Oh, yeah, brother.
Okay. So, has anybody else been down there recently to interview you about all of this?
Yeah, there's been quite a few people recently because we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so the freedmen themselves have been wanting to get their story out, not just the story from the state Black people's narrative, but the native Black people narrative here. And if you ever read Booker T. Washington, when he came to Indian Territory right before statehood, he talked about the native Blacks. And be careful when you read that, because when he's talking about the native Blacks, he's talking about the Black members of the 5 civilized tribes. And then he points out there's a difference in the state Blacks that started to move in on their lands and intermarry with them. And so, you know, it's a very fascinating history. It's so complex and layered. People would find it interesting if they just discover it.
Eli, I want to thank you for participating in this conversation. And I want to thank you for being my friend and brother all these years. And hopefully we'll see a lot more years together. Thank you so much, Sandra Hope, for being a part of this.
Look, this is what I want to show you, Eli. This is the mic. This is the mic we need to give you to keep telling these truths. It's a big mic. It's a gold mic. It's got fancy buttons on the side. So, you know, the thing is, the things that you've shared, obviously you've probably been approached by people from the tribes and other people that have been upset with you, I'm sure. So, you know, the thing is, when you want to illuminate history and illuminate truths, you have to tell it all. You can't just tell the one side that makes you look good. So, you know, I think the things that you've shared have certainly been very illuminating. There's a lot of pieces there that will make people uncomfortable. But, you know, to heal, we have to rip the Band-Aid off and get comfortable.
All right.
So this is for you.
Thank you so much. And now my closing thoughts. As my grandpa used to always say, it's not about the color of your skin or the color of your eyes. It's not about the texture of your hair. It's not about the clothes you wear. It's not about that deity that you pray to as your God. What it's really all about, and we've proven it to me, is how you treat my heart. That's the most important thing. I have a lot of friends that just happen to be my people, indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. I have a lot of friends that are all related to me because of my great-grandmother that came from Puerto Rico, Black people. I have a lot of friends that their skin just happened to be white. So what? It's not about the color of your skin. It's what's happening up here and how it manifests its way through here, your heart. So I'll say to all of you, thank you for watching. And please go on Facebook Live and YouTube and type in Jay Winter Nightwolf Live. I want you to like my show. I want you to subscribe to my show. And I am really interested in what you have to say. So leave a comment so that we can get back to you. I'm Jay Winter Nightwolf, your brother and your friend. I'll talk to you again this time next week. Danada, go-i-e, wado.